My parents mortgaged their home for my brother, then tried to hijack my wedding to pay for his failure. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just picked up the microphone and delivered a toast that ended their social lives forever. My name is Christine, and for most of my 28 years, I was the silent architect of my own life, building successes in the shadows while my family celebrated blueprints that were destined to fail. My parents planned to use my wedding rehearsal dinner, a night meant to celebrate my future, as a fundraising event for my brother's latest failed venture. They saw me not as a daughter to cherish, but as a final line of credit. They believed I would stand quietly by, just as I always had, while they passed a collection plate for their golden boy. But they didn't know that I had spent years drafting a different kind of plan for my own liberation. They didn't know that as they prepared their speech of desperation, I was preparing my own speech of declaration. This isn't just one of those family revenge stories you hear about. This is the story of how I took the microphone they intended to use for begging and turned it into a gavel, bringing down a final judgment on decades of emotional debt. What they thought would be their salvation became their public disgrace, all unfolding under the soft glow of fairy lights and the shocked expressions of our closest friends and family. If you've ever been made to feel like a supporting character in your own life story, hit that like button to let me know I'm not alone. But before we get to that rehearsal dinner, before the microphone was passed and the silence in the room became deafening, you need to understand the architecture of my family. You need to see the blueprints. From the outside, we were a postcard from the American dream, nestled in a quiet suburb of Austin, Texas. My father, Richard, was a successful insurance broker, and my mother, Shirley, was a respected member of the local school board. We lived in a 2-story brick house with a sprawling oak tree in the front yard, the kind of tree kids dream of having a swing on. But inside that house, the foundation was cracked. It was compromised by a silent, unspoken rule. My brother, Walter, was the investment, and I was the insurance policy. His dreams were nurtured with cash, encouragement, and blind faith. My accomplishments were met with a polite nod and filed away, a safety net they hoped they'd never need. It wasn't one single act of cruelty. It was the slow, steady erosion of my worth through 1,000 daily transactions. It was the quiet assumption that my resources, my time, my energy, and eventually, my money were communal property, a reserve account for Walter's inevitable emergencies. It creates a strange dynamic, doesn't it? Let me know in the comments. Were you the designated savior in your family, always expected to fix things? Or were you the celebrated star, whose path was always paved for you? I'm genuinely curious to see the balance. I quickly learned that my role was to be the savior, but the only person I could truly save was myself. While Walter was the star quarterback, his games attended by my parents with the devotion of pilgrims, I was in the library, building a different kind of future. I learned to be invisible and self-sufficient. In high school, I won a state-level award for a community park design I created. My prize was a small scholarship and a certificate. My parents' congratulations was a brief, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation immediately shifted to the new custom cleats they had ordered for Walter. That was the moment I understood. Their pride was a finite resource, and it was fully allocated. So, I poured everything I had into my own escape plan. I applied for every scholarship I could find, writing essays late into the night fueled by cheap coffee and sheer will. The day I received my acceptance letter to the University of Texas at Austin, along with a full academic scholarship, I felt a surge of triumph that was mine alone. My college years were a blur of work and study. I wasn't at football games or fraternity parties. I was in the studio until 2 a.m., perfecting designs and working weekends at a local nursery, my hands raw from potting soil, just to cover my rent and books. Every achievement was a brick I laid myself, building a life far away from the shadow of my brother's spotlight. I graduated with honors, debt-free, with a job offer from a top landscape architecture firm in Austin. I had built it all on my own. You would think that building a successful career from scratch, that my complete financial independence, would have made my parents proud. But in the economy of my family, my success wasn't an asset to be celebrated, it was a resource to be eyed. While I was meticulously saving and investing, my parents were treating their savings account like a venture capital fund for my brother, Walter. and the returns were catastrophic. They paid over $250,000 for his business degree from a private university, an education he mostly partied his way through. His first brilliant idea was a craft brewery. My father, Richard, co-signed a business loan that made my stomach churn, and they threw him a lavish launch party that cost more than my first car. The brewery went bankrupt in 18 months. Next was a tech startup, a meal planning app he claimed would revolutionize the Austin food scene. More money vanished into that black hole. Every time he failed, they called it a learning experience. Every dollar I earned was a quiet confirmation of my safe, uninspired career path. They never saw the irony. They saw him as a visionary, and I was just dependable, reliable, the emergency contact, the one who would always be okay on her own, so they never had to bother. It's an incredibly lonely feeling, isn't it, to be the family's designated adult? If your responsible nature has ever been taken for granted, just type the word always in the comments below. I need to know I'm not the only one. The word always is the perfect description for it. I was always the responsible one, so they never had to be. This unspoken rule wasn't just about business loans. It seeped into every corner of our lives, creating a series of painful, parallel realities. The year I turned 26, after years of living with roommates and meticulously saving every extra dollar, I bought my first home, a small, 700 square foot condo in South Austin. I put down 20%, a down payment of $40,000 that represented countless skipped vacations and late nights working on freelance projects. I was so proud. When I told my parents, my father's only comment was a cautious, "Make sure you're not over-leveraged, Christine." 3 months later, they gave Walter $60,000 for a down payment on a sprawling 4-bedroom house he needed for his brewery business headquarters. They called it a loan, but we all knew it was a gift. When my firm made me the lead architect on a major city park project, a career-defining achievement, I called my parents, excited to share the news. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes before my mother had to go because Walter was stopping by. The following week, they framed and hung the ridiculous logo he had designed for his failed app in their living room. My public park design, which would be enjoyed by thousands of people, was never mentioned again. Their house was a museum of his attempts, while my successes didn't even warrant a refrigerator magnet. But in a house where my successes were treated like secrets, there were 2 places I felt seen. The first was the small, sun-filled apartment of my great-aunt Millie. She was my grandmother's younger sister, a retired librarian with a sharp mind and a quiet warmth. While my parents' home was a shrine to Walter's ambitions, Millie's tiny guest room was a shrine to my reality. She had framed my university acceptance letter. She kept a scrapbook of every award and honorable mention I'd ever received. She wouldn't just ask how my job was going. She would ask about the specific challenges of a retaining wall design or the sourcing of native Texas limestone for a project. With her, I wasn't the dependable daughter or the backup plan. I was just Christine, the architect. The second light, the one that changed the entire trajectory of my life, was David. We met through a mutual friend, and from our first date, the feeling was less like fireworks and more like coming home. He listened. It sounds so simple, but it was a revelation. He saw my drive not as a threat or an oddity, but as the most essential part of me. Meeting his family was even more profound. The first time I went to their Sunday barbecue, his father spent an hour asking me about sustainable design practices. His mother later pulled me aside and, with tears in her eyes, told me she was in awe of what I had built for myself. They saw my accomplishments not as a reflection on them, but as a reflection of me. It was in their warm, unassuming backyard that I finally understood what real family pride felt like. That feeling of being unconditionally loved became my anchor, which was a blessing because the following spring, that anchor was tested. We lost Aunt Millie. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving a void that felt immense. A week later, her lawyer called me. In her will, alongside her collection of classic books, she had left me her entire life savings, $75,000. The check came with a handwritten note. It read, "For my brilliant Christine, build a foundation that is truly, unshakably yours. You have earned it." I wept, not just for the loss, but for this final, profound act of being seen. The money felt sacred. But to my parents, it was just a resource that had come available. 2 weeks after the funeral, they invited me to a family dinner. The pretense was to cheer me up, but the atmosphere was thick with purpose. After dessert, my father cleared his throat. "Christine," he began, "your mother and I have been talking. Walter's new sports nutrition line is on the verge of a major breakthrough. All it needs is one final capital injection to secure a distributor." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. My mother, Shirley, reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. "Honey, we see Millie's gift as a sign. It's a chance for you to be a part of the family's success. Have you ever been in a position where your personal financial security was suddenly treated like a communal piggy bank? If you've ever had to say no to a family member to protect your own future, type boundary in the comments." Because that night, for the first time, I looked them in the eye and said it. Number. That single word, no, landed in the middle of the dining room table like a declaration of war. My refusal to hand over Aunt Millie's legacy wasn't seen as a reasonable boundary, it was seen as the ultimate betrayal. The aftermath was a chilling silence that lasted for weeks, broken only by my mother's passive-aggressive texts about the importance of family solidarity. They weren't just disappointed, they were furious that their emergency fund had suddenly developed a mind of its own. In the midst of this Cold War, something wonderful happened. David proposed. He took me to the Zilker Botanical Garden, the place where we'd had one of our first dates, and under a canopy of twinkling lights, he asked me to be his wife. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I couldn't wait to share the news, foolishly hoping it might thaw the ice with my parents. I was wrong. When I called them, giddy with excitement, my mother's response was lukewarm at best. "Oh, that's nice, dear," Shirley said, her voice flat. Then came the question I should have expected. "David's father works in tech, doesn't he? Does he know any venture capitalists? Walter's really looking to network." I felt the air leave my lungs. My engagement, my future, my happiness, it was all immediately repurposed as a potential asset for my brother. When I later tried to involve my mother in the wedding planning, inviting her to go dress shopping, she claimed she was too busy helping Walter prepare for a critical investor pitch. It became painfully clear, my joy was an inconvenience, but his endless pursuit of it was their life's mission. I tried to ignore the chill from my parents and focused on the warmth of my new life with David. We dove into wedding planning, a happy whirlwind of cake tastings and venue tours, creating a bubble of joy that felt impenetrable. That bubble burst on a Tuesday afternoon when my father called, his voice tight with an unfamiliar panic. "You need to come over, Christine. Now. It's an emergency." I arrived to find them sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of unopened, red-stamped envelopes between them. My father, Richard, couldn't even look at me. "It's Walter's business," he mumbled. "It's all gone. The investors pulled out." My mother then delivered the final, devastating blow. "To get him started," she said, her voice trembling, "we took out a second mortgage on the house. $250,000. And now, we're going to lose it all." The room fell silent, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I braced myself for what was coming next. "Your wedding," Shirley said, her eyes pleading. "The garden, the caterer, it's $40,000, Christine. If you just have a small ceremony here, in the backyard, that money would be enough to make the back payments. It would save our home." They stared at me, their faces a mask of desperate expectation. They had set their own house on fire and were now asking me to be the extinguisher, using my own future as the water. There's a special kind of pain that comes when the people who are supposed to protect you ask you to sacrifice yourself instead. If you have ever been expected to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, share this story. It needs to be heard. I left my parents' house that night in a state of shock, the audacity of their request ringing in my ears. I didn't give them an answer. I couldn't. The next evening, as I was trying to explain the whole sordid mess to David, there was a loud knock on my door. It was Walter. He didn't look apologetic, he looked furious, as if I were the one who had wronged him. "I cannot believe you," he started, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mom and Dad are about to lose their home, their legacy, and you're hesitating because you want a bigger party? The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but what he said next is what finally shattered the last dam of my restraint. "This is so typical, Christine. You always have to be the perfect one, with the perfect grades and the perfect career. Do you have any idea how much pressure that puts on me?" A raw, incredulous laugh escaped my lips. "Pressure?" I shot back, my voice shaking with years of suppressed rage. "You want to talk about pressure? Try putting yourself through college while your parents pay for your brother to fail. Try building a career from nothing while they fund one disastrous fantasy after another. My success was never your burden, Walt. Your constant, catastrophic failures are the burden. You're not an entrepreneur. You're a financial black hole they've poured their entire lives into, and now you have the gall to come here and blame me for not wanting to jump in after them. The bank is closed." After the confrontation with Walter, my family went completely silent. Weeks passed. Invitations were sent, RSVPs came back, and the wedding planning moved forward, creating a fragile peace I was desperate to protect. I foolishly thought they had finally accepted my decision. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called. Her voice was syrupy, a tone she only used when she wanted something she knew she had no right to ask for. She offered a hollow apology for the recent unpleasantness and said that, as a gesture of peace, she and my father wanted to give a special toast at the rehearsal dinner. "Just a few words," she cooed, "to celebrate you and David and the joining of our families." My instincts screamed that it was a trap, but I cautiously agreed, too exhausted to fight. The truth came 3 days later, in a panicked phone call from a distant cousin. "I don't know if I should be telling you this," she whispered, "but you have to know what your mother is planning." Shirley had been calling her own list of guests business contacts of my father, old family friends known for their wealth, and inviting them to my rehearsal dinner. She told them her toast would be a special presentation on the future of the family. My cousin had overheard the full plan. My mother intended to deliver a tearful monologue about Walter's genius, their temporary financial struggles, and the sacrifices they'd made, subtly painting my beautiful wedding as an extravagant act of selfishness while they suffered. It wasn't a toast, it was an ambush. A public shakedown designed to guilt-trip guests into investing in my brother's failure. There's a unique horror in discovering that the people closest to you are plotting your humiliation. Tell me, have you ever uncovered a secret agenda that made you question everything you thought you knew about your family? Discovering their plan didn't break me. It forged what was left of my heart into steel. That night, I walked into the private dining room of that upscale Austin restaurant not as a nervous bride, but as a strategist. David squeezed my hand under the table, my silent partner in the coup to come. I watched as my mother, Shirley, stood up, glass in hand, and delivered the performance of a lifetime. She spoke of the importance of family, of lifting each other up during temporary hardships. She painted a heartbreaking picture of my brother, a visionary genius battling against an unfair world, all while never explicitly asking for money. The air grew thick with pity and discomfort. The investors she'd invited looked awkward. She sat down to a smattering of polite, confused applause. Before my father could stand, I was already moving. I walked to the front of the room, took the microphone, and smiled. "Wow, Mom. Thank you for those incredibly moving words about sacrifice," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It makes what I have to say next even more meaningful. As many of you know, I was recently the beneficiary of the immense generosity of my late great-aunt Millie. She taught me that the greatest investment is in potential that's backed by hard work. That is why, in her honor, David and I are donating $15,000 of that inheritance to establish the Millie Patterson Scholarship for Architectural Excellence at the University of Texas. It will go to students who, like me, rely on merit, not miracles, to build their future. Finally, I want to thank my new family, the Jacksons, for showing me what true, unconditional support looks like." The room was silent for a beat, and then it erupted in genuine, thunderous applause. I did not look at my parents. I didn't have to. I could feel their humiliation burning a hole through the wall. The rehearsal dinner stripped them of their power, and the silence that followed was heavy with defeat. I half expected them not to show up on my wedding day, but they did. Public image, after all, was the only currency they had left. They arrived at the Zilker Botanical Garden, my father looking uncomfortable and my mother, Shirley, wearing a floor-length gown of pale champagne gold, a color so close to white it was a final, pathetic act of defiance. They walked towards the front, expecting the seats of honor, only to be stopped by the seating chart. I had placed them at table 12, in the 4th row. The front row was reserved for David's parents, my professional mentor, and a single chair with a white rose on it for Aunt Millie. I watched from a distance as my mother's face tightened, a flash of pure fury in her eyes, before she smoothed it over with a practiced, brittle smile. She was powerless, and she knew it. Later, during the cocktail hour, fate delivered a final, beautiful little piece of poetry. A caterer, navigating the crowded lawn, was jostled by a laughing guest. A full tray of red wine sangria tipped, and the entire contents cascaded directly down the front of my mother's attention-seeking gown. A collective gasp went through the crowd. From across the lawn, I saw the dark crimson stain spread, a perfect, bloody Rorschach test on her pale dress. And I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, unshakable calm. Sometimes the most powerful moves in these family revenge stories aren't the loud explosions, but the quiet, deliberate acts of putting people exactly where they belong. If you believe in the power of subtle justice, type checkmate in the comments. With my mother's grand performance officially neutralized, a quiet, beautiful peace finally settled over the evening. For the first time all day, I was able to step back and truly see what I had built. As a landscape architect, the Zilker Botanical Garden wasn't just a venue to me, it was a canvas. I had designed every detail to reflect the life I wanted, authentic, strong, and serene. Soft uplighting made the ancient live oaks look like silent, wise guardians. The air was filled with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and cedar. Instead of loud, elaborate centerpieces, we had simple arrangements of white peonies and native Texas greenery, elegant in their understatement. Everything was a quiet rebellion against the world my parents represented. Theirs was a world of loud, desperate pitches, of flashy logos on failing products, of shimmering gold dresses that screamed for attention. My world, the one I had built with David, was rooted in the quiet confidence of things that grow. It was in the strength of the old stone pathways and the delicate resilience of the flowers. Seeing my mother dab at the spreading crimson stain on her dress was the perfect metaphor for it all. Her garishness, her desperate need to be the center of attention, simply could not survive here. It was an invasive species, and the healthy, balanced ecosystem I had cultivated had, in its own gentle way, rejected it. This wedding was more than a ceremony. It was my first truly independent piece of architecture. As I stood opposite David under the sprawling branches of that ancient oak tree, listening to him say his vows, the last remnants of my old life fell away. He didn't promise me a fantasy, he promised me a partnership. He promised to be the person who would always see my name on a project and feel a swell of pride. He promised to be the one who would listen to my doubts and remind me of my strength. He promised to be my family. In that moment, the years of fighting to be seen by my parents felt like a distant memory from someone else's life. Later, during our first dance, with my head resting on his shoulder, I looked out at the faces illuminated by the soft lantern light. I saw my parents at their distant table, looking small and isolated, adrift in a sea of joy they couldn't be a part of. And then I saw them. David's mother, wiping a happy tear from her eye. His father, raising a glass in a silent toast. My friends from work and college, laughing and cheering. It hit me with the force of a revelation. I hadn't been left behind. I had been liberated. I hadn't lost a family. I had finally been free to recognize the one that had been building itself around me all along. This was my family, the people who showed up, who celebrated without condition, who loved me not for what I could provide, but for who I was. The weight I had carried for 28 years finally lifted, and all that was left was light. Looking back, the silence from my parents after the wedding was the greatest gift they ever gave me. The space they vacated in my life didn't fill with anger or resentment, it filled with peace. I learned that justice isn't always a thunderous event that rights every wrong. Sometimes, it's the quiet, steady dawn after a long and painful night. It's the freedom to build a life based on your own values, not the ones imposed upon you. The The concept of karma, of consequences, also became clear. My parents didn't lose their house because of my actions. They lost it because of a long series of choices they made, prioritizing ego over wisdom, favoritism over fairness. My brother, Walter, eventually had to get a real job, humbled by the reality that the world doesn't offer the same endless bailouts as enabling parents. As for forgiveness, I realized it isn't about absolving them. Forgiveness, for me, was about accepting that they would never be the family I needed, and then letting go of the hope that they ever would be. It was about giving that energy back to myself, to my husband, and to the family we are now building, one rooted in respect and unconditional love. My story isn't just a tale of family revenge. It's a story about reclamation. It's about reclaiming your worth, your peace, and your future from the people who are supposed to build you up but tried to tear you down instead. And if you have walked a similar path, know that your true family is not the one you are born into, but the one you build with love and courage. If these stories speak your truth, subscribe and become a part of a community that understands.